Alright, I realized that towards the end, well, yeah, towards the end of what I wanted to record, that the phone had died. Let me see if I can pick up in part two, pick up where we left off. I think I talked about most of the things here. I was getting to the point where we're talking a little bit about just pure oils. The two that generally come to mind is tongue oil and then linseed oil. So tongue oil will eventually dry. It takes a little while. I think the general recommendations, what I've seen online, is for applying tongue oil, it's 1 coat per day for a week, 1 coat per week for a month, and then 1 coat per month for a year. I've generally found that I usually put on like 3 or 4 coats within a week, and that's kind of where I leave it. Again, I prefer finishes where you can feel the wood, not so much a heavy film finish. So I tend to go a little bit lighter on some of these. The other just single pure oil would be linseed oil. There are 2 versions of linseed oil. You've got boiled linseed oil, and that can actually be heated up. It's not necessarily boiled, but it's heated up so those oils polymerize, which basically means the oils will dry. Or they put mineral dryers or metal dryers in it that will allow that oil to dry. You want to look for boiled or polymerized linseed oil because the other stuff never dries. Sort of the non-boiled linseed oil is kind of something you want to stay away from unless you have some specific reasons you're using it for other things. But generally, as a furniture finish, the unboiled linseed oil is not something we typically want to use. Okay. Another oil that I will use on food contact things is mineral oil. So for cutting boards, charcuterie boards, sushi boards, that type of stuff, where the wood is coming into direct contact with the food, I'll typically use just a mineral oil, a walnut oil, some sort of nut oil is generally okay, not tongue oil. Any sort of those more penetrating oils, and you have to reapply these things as that oil is worn away. So a lot of times if I send a pretty nice board out to a client, I'll include a small jar of mineral oil so they can reapply it. What else do I have? Rattle can lacquer. So I don't use this so much on furniture, but if I'm laser engraving something and I just kind of want to sort of preserve that I liked engraving with the laser. Sometimes I'll put this on beforehand, and it's easier to wipe the burn marks off. But yeah, the rattle can works a little bit better for that sort of project. There's other applications if I'm lasering on top of tile or something else like that. I'll use the rattle can. But generally I don't use it on furniture. Just these little cans takes a while to apply to a relatively modest sized piece of furniture, and I really just don't like the smell. So, alrighty, what else? Okay, so let's talk about the finish that I typically wind up using. It's kind of more of a mixture of this type of stuff. It's going to be an oil varnish finish. I use tongue oil, my spar varnish, and mineral spirits. So, and this pretty much works exactly, the application is going to be pretty much exactly like the true oil or any of the sort of wiping oil finishes. I generally start about 1/3 of each of these, and there's a jar I've got mixed up. Also, any of these finishes, what I try to do, whether it's the spar varnish or the true oil or something, I don't like to leave this container open because the more air that gets in there, that finish starts to harden inside the container. So what I like to do is pour it out into another container that I can then use for that piece of furniture, that type of thing, and hopefully preserve what's in here. There are some people that will actually, I guess there's little CO2 containers or whatever, they'll actually wind up floating some sort of gas in the rest of this container that's heavier than air, so you're forcing the air out of it. So what stays in the container lasts a lot longer. I don't go to that extreme, but like I said, I do try to pour the smaller amounts into something else that I can then use on my piece of furniture. So this is a mixture of those three of those. I think I might have put a little bit more mineral spirits in this. So if I want more protection, I will increase the percentage of the spar varnish. If I want it to penetrate a little bit more, I may wind up either increasing the solvent or the oil, thinning out everything to allow it to soak into the wood a little bit more. Not getting very deep into the wood, but we might get in 1/16, maybe an 1/8 if we're lucky. If I want it to be a little less shine, then definitely increasing the tung oil over the varnish produces that result. So I've got my stretcher here, so real quick I'll show you how this works. The one other thing I'm going to say before I do this is any rag that comes into contact that you've used for applying any of these oil-based finishes, be extremely careful how you dispose of that rag. As oil-based finish, as it dries, it generates heat. If you've got a rag bundled up, it can and has spontaneously combusted. People have lost their workshops because they had a rag soaked in oil sitting next to some other flammable material. Particularly here in a workshop, wood shop. I've got, piles of sawdust. Trash cans probably got some scraps wood, scrap veneer, some sawdust in it from when I'm cleaning the floor. If I were to throw that rag in there and it combusted overnight, I'd have a good garbage fire. Could easily, sort of burn down the rest of the shop. So I either have a metal container, and I've got an old peanut can up there that I wind up putting these things in. I lay them flat, so it's not a sort of concentrated mass. That allows it to dissipate heat a little bit better rather than being balled up. So I lay it flat, allow it to get lots of air on it, so it winds up drying evenly rather than just sort of potentially again causing a fire. At the school, we have sort of metal trash cans that you would put that rag into it. Years ago, we used to have them hanging out on a clothesline. That works as well. Just allow it to dry where it's not going to potentially catch something on fire. So be extremely careful with these oil-soaked rags. You do not want to burn down your shop, house, or whatever. Okay. So I'm going to step to this side. And I generally like these oil-based finishes on darker woods. It just leads to sort of a nice warming effect on it. So also what I'm going to be careful about this is I don't want to get finish on any area I'm going to glue. If I do, that glue is going to not be able to adhere over the finish. The one exception would be the shellac, but still I'm counting on the wood glue to sort of penetrate in those small pores in the ends of these cells and be able to create a stronger bond. Even shellac, I will fill those pores, and that glue surface is not going to be as strong as it should. Okay. So this is a piece of sapele, and this is an example of do as I say, not as I do, because I got oil on my tan. So what I'm going to do is let that sit there for a few minutes, and then I'm going to take another rag and wipe the excess off. So let me cut this rag in half real quick, and this is what I'll use to remove that excess oil off the piece. So basically this is sort of the way you apply most of these oil-based finishes. Allow it to soak on there 10-15 minutes. I'm not going to do that, go that long right now, because we're going to sit here for 15 minutes watching oil dry rather than getting anything useful out of it. I'll leave it sit on there for a few minutes and I'll wipe it off, sort of get a basic idea of sort of what the process is. Anything else? So there's an aspect called finishing the finish. So what a lot of people will do after they apply one of these other finishes, they'll buff it out either with a Scotch-Brite pad, 4/0 steel wool, something to kind of take off those dust nibs and whatever else the contaminants or bumps have gotten onto the finish, and then they'll apply wax over top of it. If you have a high gloss finish like the regular Epifanis, you can also take steel wool or a really fine sandpaper. I've got some Festool pads at 1,000 grit. I think I might have had 2,000 grit at one point. But I can take a really fine silicon carbide sandpaper, lubricate that finish with a little bit of water, and then wind up buffing, sort of putting scratch patterns in that very high gloss finish to bring that sheen down. And then I may put like a light coat of wax over top of it or something, just as if I want more of a matte finish rather than a high gloss finish. Epifanis also sells a version of the spar varnish, has a matte finish. It's intended as a final top coat over top another finish. So say for example I have one of the paddle boards, and I wanted less than that sort of high gloss, really bright work type finish. I could do all my finishing with the gloss because it builds up faster, and then wind up taking that matte Epifanis and putting the final coat over top of it. Alright, so let's go ahead and just wipe this down. So I'm just taking the excess oil off, sort of making sure there's no puddles on this. If I leave sort of more saturated areas, the sheen is going to be uneven, and I don't really want that. Sort of if I want a high gloss finish on it, I need to sort of be diligent and careful about putting multiple coats on to sort of achieve that sort of high sheen. Just leaving a pool of oil on it is not going to do the trick. So, alright, so that is what that finish looks like. Let me see if I can tilt it up here so you can see we got a little bit of sheen to it. That's generally more of what I'm comfortable with. Again, I sort of want to see the wood, I want to see the texture, the grain, the pores. I want to feel the wood, so I generally like these sort of thinner, sort of non-film or not heavy film finishes. So I'll probably put, I think for this little bench, I may put another coat on it, but I don't know whether today I'll wind up recording the demo on gluing up the little bench, or I may do it tomorrow and then put another coat on this in the morning or something. But for this particular little bench, I'm not too concerned about having a real thick finish on these interior parts. They're not going to get that much of abuse. The outside might be a different issue, but again, it's like, the little bench is something somebody's going to stand on. So I don't want a real sort of slippery finish on that. I want something that people are going to stick to, so I may just leave it natural. Just sand it down, up to 220, maybe 320, just so it's a nice, smooth surface, but doesn't have any finish on it. The other thing I could do is I could take some sand, ground up walnut shells, put a sort of film finish on that, and then sprinkle that stuff on top. So you get the film finish, but you get a little bit of sort of grippy texture from either that real fine sand or the walnut shells. And that could be an option for sort of, again, having a nice finish on it, something that protects it, but also has enough of a texture to it that somebody's not going to slip as they stand on top of that little bench. Anything else? So that covered most of the finishes that I've got here. One other one that might come to mind is, again, Chris Schwartz, I think some shakers and that type of stuff, they've used soap finishes. So it's kind of like this sort of non-fragrant sort of bar type soap or powder type soap that you can also apply and use as a finish. I'm not real well versed in those because I haven't really used them. But yeah, play with finishes. See what you like. Take one of the finishing classes at Red Rocks. Both Sean and Randy are extremely knowledgeable about finishes, and for a whole class, that's what you do. So you get pretty well versed at sort of playing with these finishes. In those classes, you will do a fair bit of spraying. Maybe not so much this semester, but certainly most semesters there's quite a bit of air gun use in that spray booth. So that's it. So I'll clean up this mess and sort of get ready to glue up this little bench, and that will probably be the next demo.